all the things you think would make it hard to watch a silent film are exactly why it works and why you're so engaged. But as an accompanist, I feel my responsibility is to understand the world of the film, sometimes understanding the world and the viewpoint of the director, and get people drawn up into the screen and keep them there until the show is over.
He is one of the classic film world's leading silent film accompanists, as well as a historian, publisher, and teacher.
He composes and performs live music on piano and organ everywhere from MoMA to the Library of Congress's Packard Campus Theater.
Ben Modell is our not-so-silent guest on today's episode. My name is Nancy Magarill. I'm a singer, songwriter, composer, performer, graphic and web designer.
And I'm Peter Michael Marino, and I'm a writer, producer, creator, performer, and educator.
We are New York-based artists you may or may not have heard of.
And we are here to introduce you to other artists you may or may not have heard of. Ben Modell, we met much later in my career than I had liked. I wish that we had met earlier. We met working on a parallel exit show called The Final Reel, and that was a live stage show that involved a human being from the real world going into a silent movie, and everything in that part of the show, which was the whole show, was silent, and you were tasked with creating a score.
Yeah.
And one thing I noticed was so this was brand new for me. Working with Parallel Exit was brand new for me. Working with you was brand new.
And what is Parallel Exit? Is that a theater company?
You can describe it, Ben.
Physical comedy,
Yeah.
But there's also elements of circus. They do circus shows as well. They're actually doing something called Sunset Circus, and they're also in Fizz Fest with a new show. But they do all sorts of things involving physical comedy and circus, and they've done
fun.
They've done a number of theater pieces in the 2010s that were unusual in terms of the structure and format. There's a show I did music for called Everybody Gets Cake, which was in this little 12 by 12 theater. It's like the smallest space at 59 East 59th Street. Peter, did you see that show?
I love that theater.
No, but I'm very familiar with the history of that show.
Yes, of course you are. So they're really trying to find ways to bring physical comedy into 21st century theater in interesting ways, and not just doing things like the insert the blank, fill in the blank goes wrong kind of a show.
Yeah. Although everything does go wrong in the show.
Yeah. So in that show, I was doing all the music and I was performing it live, but I was also kind of and the music was another character in the show.
So this was two cool things that I remember from that. I mean, but two cool things I remember from that experience was there was some point in the rehearsal process, which maybe was 2 weeks, where I went, oh, each one of the characters has like their own musical theme.
Yeah.
Like, there's like a thing happening here. Okay. Oh, this band's cool. And then the other thing was that you would just talk to us about like silent movies and undercranking.
Yeah.
And which is,
what is
explain what
undercranking?
undercranking is.
Yeah. Well, undercranking, in a nutshell, this is a practice done throughout the entire silent film era, and no one ever really talked about it, and they didn't talk about it in interviews later on. But basically, we all know that silent film looks like it's film that's running faster. But what no one has realized, and I mean, I figured this out, is that everybody making the films knew this. They knew the films were going to be shown faster in theaters, and so they moved a little slower. And that's
interesting.
And so there were two things about that. One is that it allows you, at least as a comedian or stunt person, the ability to create stunts and gags that aren't funny in real life but become funny when they're sped up. You can also do things that are safer when performed and then become something else. The other part of it is that there's a movement style that they all used, where you were not only moving a little bit slower, not really slow motion, but you were not only moving a little slower, but you would put little pauses in between bits of movements. It's sort of like the analogy I came up with. It's sort of like where in mime you have to put these little corners on your movement or break things into little pieces so that they read to an audience, except you're doing it with the actual objects. It's the same kind of a rhythm. And so this was one of the things that happened.
This is so fascinating. fascinating, by the way.
So yeah, well, thank you. This
Yeah.
and it's something I knew. I mean, I'd been studying this. It had caught my interest, and I tried to figure out how it worked. And I found a number of little smoking guns where there were interviews that I found. One from 1914 or 15, and one from 1928, where there were actors at either end of the silent film era saying, "Yeah, this is exactly what we did."
And they'd have to really work hard and be trusting that gag was going to work. If they're having to do it that way, I guess they probably worked
they
enough
just
at
knew.
it. They knew.
I mean, it sort of kicked in the early teens, and once everyone figured it out, it must have just spread because everybody hung out and talked with each other. And I think that this kind of movement was something everyone was already used to from playing in giant theaters. So you know,
right,
as a performer,
you know, vaudeville people, right?
Right. So your movements have to read at the back of a 2,000 seat house. Because I shot tests with some clown friends. And one of the things we discovered was that what we would do is we'd shoot it on video and then speed it up and watch it and then do it again. And we'd see it. And over the course of 6, 7, or 8 takes of the same piece of business, there was a moment around the 6th, 7th, 8th take where we would look at what we had shot sped up. And it suddenly didn't, instead of looking like video that had been sped up, it looked like a silent film.
Yeah.
And my friend Jeff Seal, who I did some tests with, he said it reminded him of the way he had to move when performing in a huge theater. So I think everybody had this in their muscle memory from touring and doing vaudeville 14 shows a week, or if it was the circus. And once everyone realized, yes, the camera is 12 feet away, but we have to move like the camera is 120 yards away.
Yeah.
It was just, that. And then they just started doing it. And what is not clear, and it was not a deliberate decision, but there was a moment where the films were just shown faster. And instead of trying to catch up by cranking the cameras faster, because then you were using up more film, it just sort of stuck. And there was cranking speed, and then there was projection speed. And so one of the things that happened in the rehearsal process with the final reel was there was a moment where everything had been blocked, and the actors were all talking. Okay, oh yeah, well you come over here. I don't think this, and blah blah blah. Go and get me or whatever. And then Mark Lonergan, the director, said, okay, because we're going to be performing a silent movie, because the silent film was not video, it was human beings on a stage. He said, okay, you have to stop saying things out loud. And then I think we did one run at the scene, and all of a sudden everyone realized, I have no idea what anybody is doing or what they're saying. And Mark turned to me and said, well, and I said, there's another thing that I had noticed in silent movies is that in addition to all this adjustment to movements, the way people would act in silent film is that they would use gesture, not in a charades kind of a way, but it would sort of reinforce what they were saying. So it's getting late, I have to go now. You might point at your watch while you're saying that.
Yeah.
Once, not in an obvious way, but you tap it 1, 2, 3 times, and then with your thumb point behind you. I have to get going. There's something out there. And once we implemented this to match all of the things people were saying, everyone else in the scene knew what Peter was saying, or Scott McCord, or any of the other people in the show. But this is an observation I'd had. And it's kind of like if you watch someone giving a speech and next to them is an ASL interpreter, and they're not just gesturing, and they're not just, using ASL to use gesture to communicate words. If you watch their face, and sometimes it's just, they're just there very deadpan, like when people on an airplane will perform the safety thing. But the ASL interpreters, they're using their face, they're using emotions. It reinforces the things they're gesturing to reinforce it. So it's clearer. So they don't have to use their fingers to spell out absolutely every word. And so one of the byproducts of this, once we adopted this, is that friends of mine who came to see the show said that of all the things they'd ever seen that where they were trying to perform something that looked like a silent film, the silent film sequences of the final reel looked the most like an actual silent movie. On top of the fact that everything with the backgrounds were monochrome, as was the costuming and everything, and they had done projected titles that were in the correct typeface, which I recommended a couple of fonts for that. This is, I mean, if you want the silent film people to be impressed, use this sort of thing. But we were sort of replicating without needing to move slower to compensate for the speed up, the same kind of performance technique that was happening in the 1910s and 20s.
I'm wondering about, it's interesting that you mentioned about ASL, because I'm wondering, is silent movies, are silent movies like a thing for the hearing impaired community? Is that even a thing?
I don't know. I know that there are fans of silent film who are deaf or hard of hearing. I have a home video label called Undercrank Productions. Over the last 12 years, we've released 33 DVDs and Blu-rays of silent movies you never heard of, but you should. And one of the things we started doing instead, because we can't do booklets, is to do a video essay, a 9-10 minute video essay about the movie, director, or star. And I happen to know that one of our regular backers, because most of my things are funded by fans through Kickstarter, somebody who I know is deaf. And I thought, I have to put captioning in. And I asked him, how to do this. And I figured out a way to do it, because there may be, I don't know how many. And this is something when I've been accompanying silent movies for over 40 years, and you don't see a lot of people signing to each other after the show. They may watch at home, but I don't see a lot of this at shows per se. But it is a form of film that you don't need to hear.
Yeah.
You don't need to hear what's going on. I mean, if you ever watch silent film on TCM, with the captioning on some, I think more recent releases, sometimes maybe not with silent film, but with regular TV shows, you'll see in brackets jazzy music playing.
Yeah, of course.
Ben, I also just have to jump on this undercranking thing.
Yeah.
Maybe you already know about this, but fun fact, when they filmed the musical version of Little Shop of Horrors, the plant is controlled by 10 puppeteers, right? Like the lips can really make the shape of the word. It's not just up and down like we get from most puppets. And unfortunately, and a lot of hydraulics are involved in that. Yeah. So unfortunately, they couldn't get the plant to be, in real time go, if you want a rationale, it is very hard to see. It's just too fast. So they had to film it slow, and the actors had to move slowly around
it's the exact same principle, and it's continued to be used after sound came in for car chases. If you watch car chases in movies, and
oh my god, that makes so much sense.
And if you take your eyes off of the cars and look at the people in the background, and you can see that people are walking around or moving a little too fast, and this is what's happening. Every once in a while, you'll see a shot like I was watching the first Men in Black movie when they take off in this car. I was like, oh yeah, they're undercranking like hell there, because there's just no way to do this, and it would be a cheat to do it with CGI. So they film, you shoot it at 20 frames per second, and it comes up to 24, and it looks like you're moving a lot faster than you really are.
Wow, we're basically ruining films and TV for everyone.
Yay!
Yay! No, it's just that the illusion still works. Even even if you know how sleight of hand works, magic and the illusions you see a magician do are still work, because it's we're suggesting something to you that you are interpreting with your brain, and we're tricking you into thinking what you're seeing is actually happening.
So I'm a little confused, because I want to know how, with all of this amazing knowledge you have about all of this and the work you clearly have done with clowning and all of this work, how did you get into composing for this?
That's kind of where I started with that, and the stuff with performance and working with clowns came later, because I really, again, during the 2010s, I became very interested in how these films were made from the perspective of the actors, and what was going on in their minds and their bodies to make these things, instead of just looking at them from the outside, which is the way most film historians will. I've always been a huge fan of silent movies from I was a toddler.
How did that? Are you a tri-state person? You're a New Yorker, right?
Yeah.
So you, I think, grew up with WPIX.
Yeah.
So we got to see silent stuff. We got to see Hal Roach stuff. We got to see a lot of that.
Yeah, and the public television station, which not every PBS affiliate ran this, but in the 1970s, there was a show called The Silent Years, produced by Paul Killiam, which had new restorations at the time with beautiful new musical scores by a guy named William Perry, who was MoMA's film accompanist. So I would see films that way.
As a kid,
yeah. growing up, and I would, you would save up paper route money and lawn mowing money and buy 8mm copies. It was the only way to see things at the time. I also
like you were like asked your parents for a projector.
Yeah.
And showed movies in the basement.
Yeah. I bought a projector and, and a camera and film and all that. So I was a Super 8 filmmaker growing up, a film collector to some degree. I grew up in Westchester County and in a town called Larchmont. And when I was 12, I got as a present, it was bar mitzvah present, a book called The Silent Clowns, written by Walter Kerr, who was the drama critic of the New York Times and the Herald Tribune prior to that.
I want to read that book.
I devoured the book, and Walter Kerr and his wife Jean lived in that Please Don't Eat the Daisies house at the end of Beach Avenue, right on the shore in Larchmont. And my mom remembered that they lived in our town, and my dad remembered hearing or reading somewhere that Walter Kerr had a huge 16mm film collection and would show movies to their friends when they come over for dinner. And I'm this 12-year-old kid, and I wrote him a letter.
Of course you did.
Telling him I was very interested in seeing more silent film, and told him of my deep interest in it. And 4 days later, he called and said, "Well, yes, you can, And so for the next 15, maybe or 20 years, I would go to his house always on a Monday night because he wasn't at the theater reviewing. I was there on dark night. I'd come over and he'd say, "Well, what do you want to see?"
What?
And so I arrived
at
at film school having already seen all of the Buster Keaton features, Harry Langdon, Harold Lloyd, Charlie Chaplin, a comedian named Raymond Griffith. Walter Kerr had these two projectors, going back and forth. He had a reel-to-reel tape recorder with musical scores that he'd cobbled together from records, and he would sit in the back of the room smoking cigars.
Oh my goodness! So
I mean, the smell of cigar smoke is a very visceral thing for me. Between that and the fact that both of my grandfathers were cigar smokers.
My father was a cigar smoker, so it has that effect for me.
And so between that and all the great comedians like Ernie Kovacs and George Burns and Groucho Marx, I mean, you associate it. At any rate, I went to film school as a film production major at NYU.
Oh, okay. Yeah, production major. But
they were showing.
You were playing mute. You were also learning piano, right?
Yeah, I was also
taking. Had to have been.
Yeah, so there were these concurrent things running at the same time. I was interested in silent film. I was interested in making films, and I also was taking piano lessons.
Oh my
gosh! And I wasn't conservatory material or anything, but I could play, and I had a good teacher who made me play certain things, but also allowed me to play other things I was interested in, taught me a little basics of improvisation. The basic film history course at NYU for many years, the first semester was silent film, second semester sound up through around 1950. And this is again before video. So we're watching 16mm prints in dead silence. And I don't know what possessed me because I was incredibly uncomfortable around people. But I got this idea of volunteering to accompany the silent films in this film history class in my sophomore year. And the head of the department loved the idea, and I started. And the thing that made it easy, sort of, I think, with two things. One is, well, everyone's watching the movie, so they're not going to be paying attention to me as much. But also, I was helping these films, which was the main thing.
Did you already have a repertoire of the music from that?
Not really. I mean, I knew some classical music. I had played some ragtime, and I knew some basics of improvisation. What I did is I tried to meet every person in New York City who was accompanying silent films.
Wow!
And there were 5 or 6 people.
I was going to say there were people doing that. There was more than one.
Well, I think Donald Sosin was playing, Steve Sterner, a guy named Stuart Oderman, who's since passed, William Perry at the Museum of Modern Art. I met him, and he answered some questions. And I met a guy at a place that doesn't exist, an old a repertory cinema called the Carnegie Hall Cinema, which is now Zankel Hall. But at the time, it was a repertory house and had a Wurlitzer organ in it that was played by a man named Lee Irwin, who was a movie organist from the 1920s. And he became a friend and a mentor to me and was a staunch improviser and brilliant musician and composer. And so basically, I was, while I was in college trying to learn or develop my filmmaking chops, I was in what I call silent film accompaniment boot camp, playing for 2 or 3 classes a week between the basic film history class, and then there was a guy named William K. Everson. Bill Everson is, at the time, a very well-known historian, someone who saved a lot of film, wrote a lot of books, and he would teach a class that would meet twice a week. And so I was playing for 2 features a week for Everson's classes, plus this other thing. And in between either of these things, I'd go over to Lee's house, say, listen, I'm playing for this next week. What do you think? I was going to do this. What do you think? And he would share things with me. I would ask him things. And I just tried to absorb as much as I could. So that's how I got started.
Were you remembering the music? Are you playing by ear, or how are you?
Yeah, I was playing. I mean, I taught myself more, improvisation. I think at the beginning, I started off with, I had more music in front of me. I continued to do that. But Lee was very helpful in terms of improvisation and how to underscore a film, and not just lining up a piece of music with something in a way that sort of mirrors the on-screen action.
Oh, well, What is the key to underscoring a film?
Different kinds of films.
Historically, in the teens and 20s, it was a lot more on the surface. So you would have music that would just sort of mirror what was happening on screen. Yeah, or you would have what I call song title puns, where you'd play a song whose title matched what was happening on screen. And you see this carried on in the Warner Brothers cartoons. Well, Carl Stalling, who scored all those films, had been a movie organist. Plus, Warner Brothers loved, plugging their own song catalog. So when Bugs Bunny sits down with Daffy Duck and they start having lunch, you hear on the soundtrack, a cup of coffee, a sandwich, and you.
Yeah.
Or Oh, You Beautiful Gal, or Ain't She Sweet. These are all Warner Brothers' own songs. So it worked at the time, but even though Lee had been playing in the 20s, he had a much more contemporary sensibility about film scoring, being aware of today's audiences. And so what I learned from him is the importance of disappearing. And he always said the best thing you can hear from somebody after a show is, I forgot you were playing.
Wow.
And so the music has to come from inside the film. And so the idea is to support the emotion or the drama more than to mirror it. And to
what a fine line, though.
Yeah, it is a fine line, and it's not easy. What was brilliant about Lee is that I would go to hear him play, and I thought, okay, this time I'm going to really pay attention, and I'm going to listen to what he does. And 4 minutes in, I was completely sucked into the movie, and I forgot to pay attention. And so I have recordings of his scores now that I listen to as examples. But the idea is that to not let the audience know you're there, to not let the audience know what you're doing, to smack the keys when somebody falls down or something like that, unless it's part of the joke. And I always feel like when the lights go off, I'm working for Douglas Fairbanks or Lon Chaney or Eisenstein. These people work really hard. I don't need to, have a light on me while I wave at the audience. Hey, look what I'm going to do now.
What do you think the audience, when they're coming to a silent film, do you think that they want that true experience of what it was like when that film was created? Or that, does it even matter to them what kind of music? I'm curious. I think if I were to go to a silent film, I would want to have that experience of what it was like when silent films were created. So you kind of have to make a balance, right?
Yeah, I think there's a range of expectations. I mean, there are people who will say, "Oh, I don't like that boring classical music," and they'll only go to see a silent film if there's a band of some sort. And I don't really have a problem with that kind of scoring. I've seen punk bands do an excellent job scoring a silent film, and I've seen quote unquote traditional pianists wreck a film. So it goes in. I mean, if you're really scoring the film and moving with it and going on the emotional ride and the arc of the dramatic action, if you're playing, jug band with the washboard, you can do a score that really helps the film.
You have to know the film, I would think.
It really
helps.
You need to know it and really be willing to go on the ride that's happening inside the film. My own preference is to play music that sounds like it's from the era, because anything that's outside of the era, then that's one more thing that the audience has to line up.
Yeah.
And it pushes them back a little bit.
So are you talking about when Queen did Metropolis?
Yeah, that's an example, because that's a score that exists outside of the film, and there are some performances like this with quote unquote modern scores where the ensemble is fully lit and the screen is upstage from them, and you're not sure if you're watching a concert with a movie going on or vice versa.
It's interesting. I'm thinking about that. You have so much responsibility. I mean, right? You're
Huge
you're like
responsibility.
restoring. Gosh, forgive me for not remembering right now.
It's it's the experience. I mean, silent film is an experience. It's
Yeah.
not just movies you watch, and it's not just movies with no sound. And I have a book coming out in the spring called The Silent Film Universe that is all about how this entrancement happens when you watch a silent film. You know, all the things you think would make it hard to watch a silent film are exactly why it works and why you're so engaged. But as an accompanist, I feel my responsibility is to understand the world of the film, sometimes understanding the world and the viewpoint of the director,
Yes.
and get people drawn up into the screen and keep them there until the show is over. And so anything that I do that sticks out pulls people out.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
you have to strike that balance.
But also, like, you're putting your I can't think of the name of it. It was you released it on DVD around the time we did Parallel Exit, so 5 years ago maybe. And it was a female playing a female was a king, or there was a female.
Oh, is this Beverly of Graustark with Marion Davies?
Oh, that's it.
Her cousin, who is about to ascend the throne, has a skiing accident, and the entourage who have come to escort him arrive. The cousin is in another room. Marion comes out with a ski hat on, and it's covering her hair. And also, Marion does look a lot like the actor playing her cousin, Creighton Hale. They mistake her for her own cousin, and off we go. And it's a really wonderful film, and so there's a Blu-ray out with my score on it that was a scan of the original nitrate print that belonged to Marion Davies that's been preserved by the Library of Congress.
But you then you're creating the score for this film that probably, I think it was like a lot of people hadn't seen it, right? It was pretty like regular people. It's very rare. You're putting your stamp on this thing, and then this thing is being printed on discs.
Yeah.
So you are the official soundtrack for that film, right? That's a huge responsibility.
On Blu-ray, and when they just showed it on Turner Classic Movies for Marion Davies' birthday.
Oh, wow.
Last week. So, although the idea of doing something like this where we release something on Blu-ray is that to get it back into classic and silent film fans' consciousness so they can book it and do shows and let somebody else play for it.
But what I'm saying is, like, the director and the producer in the studio are no longer in existence.
Right.
You are making these executive decisions about here's what her theme is, here's what, you know.
Right.
You're making these huge decisions with, I'm assuming no one's really overseeing that?
I am.
Yeah.
I mean
so that's
the
a
thing
huge
is that
responsibility. How do you deal with, I mean, I know that you're very fastidious. Do you like just really agonize over like notes or
at this point I don't. I mean,
you just trust your instincts.
Yeah,
and your experience.
And the other, I mean, one of the things that really opened me up in terms of composing and improvising was I studied improv in the late 80s with a group called the First Amendment. They were creating a new offshoot group called the Comedy Elite, which never materialized. The whole operation folded before anything had happened, but I learned improv, having never performed or done anything like that. I just dared myself to go on an audition I saw listed in Backstage, and I got in, and I still think they were one of the best improv troupes in the city. And then in the 90s, I also went through the Gotham City improv program. But those are things that have really opened me up in terms of my composing. So, you know, I a lot of, sometimes it's something it's a flow I'm not even aware is happening. I'm looking up at the screen, the images are coming into my head, and my hands are on the keys, the sound is coming out, and then I'm hearing it, and it cycles around and around and around. So
you're trusting your instincts.
Let me ask you a question though. When you're recording, so there's one thing about when you're going and performing in movie theaters and all and playing. When you're recording for the DVDs and for these projects, what's the different setup? I imagine you're not in a big theater. you're probably in a recording
No.
studio. So
Yeah.
how does that affect the experience for you while you're composing? Or are you recreating what you've been doing, or are you also
It's a
improvising?
kind of a mix of all of the above. So first of all, for the most part, there were no original scores for these films. It was up to the local conductors and musicians to create their own scores. If you were a soloist, and this was improvisation was a big part of the organ playing tradition, you could do that. So folks like Lee Irwin, who I knew, and there were through the 1990s, there were a number of older people who had been movie organists in the 1920s, like Bob Vaughan and John Murray and Gaylord Carter and Rosa Rio, and that was their practice. They either had a repertoire or they would improvise. But for ensemble, and there were a lot of anywhere from 5 or 6 pieces up to a full symphony orchestra, you had a library of music, production, what we would call library music today, and the local conductor compiled the score. So there was no, with the exception of some super productions, the idea that we know today of a piece of a score being locked to a film, and the idea of, well, of course you're always going to hear that music, didn't happen. It was always different. So the difference for me, the main difference is that it's because it's being recorded. The stakes are much higher.
Yeah.
At a show, I know, well, as soon as it's over, no one will remember any of it, and
Right.
that's fine.
Right. That's why I'm saying you have a huge responsibility.
Right. The pressure is much higher. And then, of course, then that makes you choke while you're playing. And I hit even more clams than I usually do. I have to go back and punch in and re-record stuff like that. But the process at this point has, I have something set up in my living room when I do the recordings, and I'm either using a digital keyboard with high-end Steinway concert D samples, or I also use virtual theater organ software. And this, I use 2 keyboards and organ pedals. It's the same functionality of an organ console, only it's something I can stick in pieces behind a file cabinet and under a bed and stuff like that, or throw in gig cases and take it in a rental car to a venue. But the samples are of an actual Wurlitzer theater pipe organ.
What are the samples? Who are you using?
There's software called Hauptwerk, Hauptwerk, which hosts the samples, and then you can load any kind of an organ you want. I use theater organ samples by a company called Paramount Organ Works, and this is samples of an actual Wurlitzer, which is one of the main brands. And then I have a video projector, so I'm looking at a big 8-foot image in my living room and not a television monitor. And that's something I started doing.
That probably helps a lot.
It did. I realized maybe 10, 12 years ago that what was frustrating me when I was recording is I wasn't able to get into the film the same way. And so I got a video projector and made a huge difference. And I will record either in large swaths for maybe an entire 10 or 15 minute segment, or I will more likely now, I will stop and start for a scene because I know I can, and then stop at a fade out and then pick it up later. I mean, that's how I did Beverly of Graustark, and when I did So This Is Paris, the Ernst Lubitsch film, and something we released in this past October, a film called The Bat from 1926, I would do it in scene by scene.
I can't even imagine how you manage all that, because I know when I'm recording and you're dealing with the keys, the computer. How are you doing that with a projector as well? Are you like jumping up and down like I have this vision?
Octopus arms.
Yeah, well,
that's a lot.
I keep trying to improve on it, and so I have a Blu-ray player. I was doing well at first. I was using the disc, and then I would use files. And I have a remote next to me, and I would hit play and then back up, and there's time code on the screen, so I could know exactly where to start. And then I start playing, and I'll when I start feeling like, oh, this is not working, I'll stop, back it up, and start all over again. And now I load the video file into I use Reaper as a recording program, and you can have that. So then it's all in one piece. So I started doing
all
that
in front of you, so you can trigger it all in front of you.
So I just hit Command R, off it goes, and I have a punch in moment where and then I start here. So I recently recorded a handful of scores for newly restored Fleischer cartoons in the 1920s, and I worked it that way. So I just have a brain for this sort of
you really do, Ben. You have a amazing
so do
brain.
you, Peter. I mean, I think that
This is true.
when everything shut down in the middle of March of 2020, both
Just
you
in
and
case
I,
anyone's forgotten.
Yeah.
yeah. Nobody wants to remember, but there are some of us who worked like hell to create entertainment for other people, and
Yeah.
I think Peter, both you and I within the same week launched our respective live streams.
Yes. Yeah.
and
Ben's was
you just
great. Because you do what you do in the live at your live shows, and I've seen your live shows at Lincoln Center and the Center at West
MoMA,
Park. I
yeah.
just saw your
Yeah.
MoMA and
Yeah.
Nosferatu, which I just saw, and you always open with like, here's a little history about this movie, like
Right.
you like tease us into it, it's and then the show that you did during pandemic, it was on Sundays, is that right? Was it on Sundays?
Every Sunday at 3:00. It was called the Silent Comedy Watch Party.
Yeah.
And one of the things I learned is never name anything more than 3 words. Because people who are devout fans of the show still get the name of it wrong.
Yeah, I almost messed it up myself.
No, don't feel bad. Everybody
It was actually reminiscent of those WPIX shows where they would have like someone telling you a little bit about this Buster Keaton thing you just watched, or this Laurel and Hardy Silent coming up. Oh, that was a great one that I saw that you did at the Lincoln Center, was the restored Laurel and Hardy Silent.
Hardy's
films.
right, yeah,
and
so the show was kind of modeled on these hosted shows, and this is why it's so important, I think, even for TCM to have the recorded human beings taking you on a trip. And so with the watch party, myself and my friend Steve Massa, who I would remote in from his apartment, he would talk about the film, but everything, it was always live. We left it up for folks who had missed it or whatever, and the scoring was also always on live. And I had software called Mimo Live, which is it's sort of like StreamYard and OBS, but it's a little bit more involved, and it allowed it was sort of like having a television control room in my laptop.
Right.
It also projected the films onto the wall over my piano and would automatically dissolve from one mic to another, from the laptop to the iPhone camera. We always had, from day one, I felt it was important to start with like a shot of me, and then would tilt up to the image of the film on the wall and then dissolve into it. And then at the end of the film, dissolve back and pan my wife, who had never operated a tripod in her life. Who really just
you always
really
credited her. We always knew she was there.
Yeah, because she wouldn't be on camera. She would always chime in and speak. And I always thought of on Mr. Rogers when they would have a segment called Picture Picture, and you'd be in his little living room set. Now let's go take a visit to So here's where they make crayons, and they'd pan up to this picture frame, and the film would start to run, and then they would zoom in and then dissolve into it, and they would do the same thing coming back out.
Yeah, it feels very authentic.
Yeah, but it's sort of a one-man band kind of tech, because I was working with my wife and Steve and his wife. None of them, and they will tell you that they are not tech savvy at all. And I was flying all of this at the same time. But the idea is there's some of us whose brains are just wired like that. And Peter, I think that the two live stream shows that you did during the pandemic, it was, you were like, okay, I'm in my apartment. We're all in our apartment. I have streaming accounts, and what can I create, and how do I make this work? And I don't know. What you did was brilliant.
If that shit happened today, I don't know what I would do. Like, I remembered turning this very room I'm in right now into like lights hanging here, and then using a soundboard, and then downloading all these programs and all this stuff. And like, it's very nerve-wracking. People are paying, and they're coming from all over the world, and you don't want to fuck it up. And
right, because you're not only are you the writer and star of the show and the director, but you're also the stage manager.
The technician.
You're calling the show.
Everything.
You're the technician. And if something locks up, you've got to solve it, because people around the planet are watching. And and
you don't know if it's even working. I remember there was one episode, there was one showing of Planet of the Grapes Live, a live show, and it was over, and I recorded every single one of them, which is probably why my computer died. And I watched it and I like called my screen manager. That's what they were called, screen managers.
Yeah.
And I was like, hey, why did you not tell me my mic was off the whole time? She's like, it sounded fine. And I was like, no, it didn't sound fine. It sounded like I was in a room talking to a laptop. It didn't sound like what we've been doing for the past 48 performances where there's a microphone clipped to my fucking body. Yeah.
Right.
But
And we had this whole system where so Mana and Steve's wife Susan were really co-piloting the show by text while Steve and I were on. And Mana would write something on a blue 5x8 blue card and say Steve's mic is off.
Yes.
There's an echo.
This is
or
what
tell Steve this or that. And so they were really they were just as involved with the whole process. And sometimes we would lose the stream and then we would point at each other, go get this wire in my other room while I do this.
Right.
We could bring. I mean, it was
the great thing was. Everyone was very forgiving during that time.
Oh my gosh. And it was like, it's just like early live television.
Yeah, right.
And I think the beauty of it also is everyone was so happy to have entertainment. People were so, everybody was home.
People were so stressed out. They just was just so happy to have it. And that's what kept us going, not just for them, but also it kept us going.
Us?
People,
absolutely. Yeah.
All of us,
The worst thing, I don't think you experienced this because you have a family, but the show is over and you're all alone. You're not meeting at the bar.
Yeah.
You're not going to the lobby. There's none of that energy. Yeah. And it's such
really a big thing.
It is still different because it took me a couple of years to realize what was kind of bugging me about doing these and why it was so stressful. And I realized that there's no applause at the end of the performance.
That's it.
Well, and not like it's some, ego-driven thing. Oh, I need to have the adoration. But you're so used to the interaction with other human beings. And then as soon as the show is over, boom. It's like
literally a vacuum.
Suddenly you're performing for a few hundred people around the planet, and then zhunk.
Yeah.
And it was
energy. Like you feel the energy of the audience. You feel like at Nosferatu. You feel the energy. By the way, folks, we're talking about the original Nosferatu.
Yes, the one from 1922.
That already has music in it. I have to ask.
It was because what was happening is you're performing in a vacuum.
Yeah.
I read or heard the story that the first time Bob Hope ever went on the radio, and he didn't have an audience there, and he's doing his monologue, and the sound engineer would hear him finish a joke, and they would hear clunk, clunk. And what was happening is that every time there was supposed to be a laugh, he would kick the microphone stand just because of that rhythm.
Wow!
Because you're performing. I mean, also we're showing comedy films, and also your show, Peter. There's comedy to it. You're killing, but you're also. Yeah. It feels like you're bombing.
I know.
It feels like you're just bombing death, and that's why we would finish the show, and you go on social media and you'd inhale the comments that will come in.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah. Here's the audience.
That's when you learn about yourself as a performer. Am I doing it for me, or am I doing it for the accolades, for the love, whatever it is?
Yeah, and this was like we were getting people. I mean, people come up to me at shows, and they have the shirt or the hat or the tote bag with our logo, and they will tell me, your show got me through the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and God, that's so wonderful. But how great that you got to be able to do that and to give that to people. I actually had an injury just as I was about to settle in and go, okay, I'm going to start performing. My shoulder totally went out. I couldn't play guitar. I couldn't do anything. I was so bummed because of all times to be able to just do concerts and things in your home, I couldn't do any of it.
Yeah.
It's killing me. So I so admire that you guys did that.
Well,
and I'm envious.
Yeah.
Ben, taking a big turn here. We're going to be wrapping up shortly. You're a visiting professor at Wesleyan University. You teach a course on silent cinema.
Yeah.
Do kids these days care about silent films?
Yeah.
Good.
My class is typically anywhere from 10 to 16 students. And the thing is that in my class, there's live. I accompany absolutely everything we see.
Oh.
I tell my students, if nothing else, you've gotten to see 13 silent film shows with live music, which I don't think you get anywhere else
No.
in any of the
Probably
film
not.
school. But I have noticed the last couple of years, the students who are signing up for my class have been more and more enthusiastic and interested in the medium than ever before. And I think some of that I'm not really sure why. I'm thrilled. But there's definitely interest. What's nice about Wesleyan is that they encourage students from different disciplines to take courses outside of their major or minor. There are some universities where if you're a dance major, that's it.
Yeah.
Or if you're a bio major, that's all you do. But I have students who are film students, someone who's a psych major, all that kind of stuff. So there's a mix of people, but there's definitely an interest in silent film that I see building a little bit. So I've been teaching the class for 10 is a course I created, and I've been teaching for 10 years there now.
Really, really cool. Have you found any young Ben Models?
No.
All right, you got this.
I love it.
You got
There will
this.
never be another Ben Model.
Hey, thanks for checking us out. Links to today's guest can be found in the show notes.
Don't forget to subscribe, like us, rate us, and tell all your friends about arts and craft.